How did the Green Troops of the US 182nd Infantry Regiment perform during their first brush with the Japanese? We look at the 5th Battle of the Matanikau.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the podcast. This is the 18th episode with Dave Holland, our expert on the Guardalcanal campaign. Last week, we looked at the impact of the naval battle of Guardalcanal and the issues that created for the Japanese with their inability to get their third large convoy in to resupply the troops on Guardalcanal. We also looked at the plan for the 5th Battle of the Matanikau. So American forces had pulled back. They thought that there was an invasion force coming in the lead up to the naval battle of Guadalcanal. So they pulled back to the east of the Matanikau River. It's now around the 18th of November. The soldiers and Marines are looking to cross the Matanikau once again. This is going to be the 5th Battle of the Matanikau. You can see how important it is as key terrain. It's been fought over on 5 separate occasions. The US is gaining the ascendancy. They've got fresh troops that are coming in. The supply situation is improving, which is the direct opposite of what's been happening for the Japanese. This battle is going to be led by the 182nd Infantry Regiment of the Imperial Division. This will be their first combat experience. The plan is to cross the Matanikau, have the 2nd Battalion, 182nd, seize Hill 66, have the 1st Battalion advance towards Point Cruz, get the engineers to rebuild mobility, and then launch a larger offensive towards Kokombona and the Pohar River. So let's get right back into our interview with Dave Holland. How did that plan go once they crossed the Matanikau?
Well, the first day, one battalion of that 182nd, which is the 2nd Battalion, had moved to the left up Hill 66, and once again, brand new troops, overburdened. And you've been there, James, walking those hills. They were suffering heat casualties very quickly. But they moved across as they expected, no resistance. The Japanese wasn't defending the river. They moved across and took 66. And they were there the first night. And then there was a famous water hole incident they call this, in a platoon down because they didn't have any water. And they were relying on Solomon Island porters and their anti-tank unit to bring, they got to hand carry these 5-gallon, 5-gallon, but these large jerry cans of water up these hills. And they just couldn't make it in time. So they ran out of water. They sent these guys down to the water hole to base of 66, typical green units. I don't know if it was because they wasn't trained that well or they just had water on their mind. They didn't put any security out. So they're down in this water hole. And you can imagine they're surrounded by ravines on all sides. And they were literally like fish in a barrel. The Japanese caught them out and they trapped them there. And miraculously, one died. I think one died, a number of wounded before they could get them out. But they left all their canteens down there. That became known as a famous water hole incident, so they learned a lesson. But anyway, at that same time, the Marines had pushed a company over on Hill 78, so they were holding there. And they started hitting some of the Japanese positions. They said, well, there's a bit strong positions here. They had to pull back, and they called some artillery in. And anyway, the 1st Battalion of the 182nd crossed. And then they hit the base of Point Cruz, and they got a bit of resistance. And they said, oh, this isn't good. This is a bit more than we expected. So they dug in. So that night, the Japanese, there were 1,000 yards between both battalions. Both battalion commander says, we got a 1,000-yard gap between our lines. We don't like this. And the Marines company pulled back. They were ordered to pull back. And the battalion commander says, I have no one on my flank. This isn't good. Once again, this is the very first time these guys have been in combat, first planning, a lot of mistakes were made. The Japanese said, okay, we're going to take advantage of this. They seen the gap. So they had 2 fresh Japanese companies, so these recently landed guys, and they, early on the morning of the 20th, they smashed into the 1st Battalion, 182nd. They proceeded with a mortar barrage. They sent those 2 companies straight into the assault. Just like the American battalion commander feared, the Japanese sent some guys up on the hill up to his flank and started pouring in fire on his flank. All 3 companies, the Americans broke and ran. This is something you don't really read too much about. They broke and ran. There's enough primary evidence to suggest they did. General Segre came up, the G3 of the division, which is the planning. He came up. They had to rally them the best they could. One report, one of the Marines, anti-tank guy, was on the mouth of Matanikau. He's platoon commander. And he see this Army guy ran up. He goes, "What are you doing?" He hands him an M1 Garand and all these bandoliers. And he said, "You're going to need these more than me, Marine." And he just kept running. It got so bad that Colonel Bill Whaling, the Marine colonel, got with the Army, and they had 3 footbridges across the Matanikau. So what they did, because they got so bad with stragglers, they set up evacuation points, medical points. So they'd put a corpsman or a medic with a senior NCO at each bridge. So if you came away from the front line, if you didn't have a medical tag, they sent you back. Because what was happening, they noticed that you'd have one wounded man come back, and it would be like 10 with him to escort him to the rear, unwounded. They're really just one way they stopped the straggling. They call them straggling points, which are very effective. But anyway, after the rally, then in that morning, it got so bad that Patch Ed came up too, and I'll talk about Patch in a second. So they rallied him enough. By almost noon, the Americans pushed back, and they advanced almost to about 200 yards short of the original position, but then they held there. The Japanese didn't take advantage of it because they didn't have any follow-on forces, because they hit the Americans very quick, gave them a bloody nose, and they pulled back. So, yeah, if they did have follow-on forces, it would have been a pretty bad situation for the Americans. It would have thrown them all the way back over across Matanikau. Once again, they were a brand new unit, and they were kind of set up to fail. I think some of the first rounds came in, took out a lot of their leadership, and some of their leadership wasn't really great in leadership. You know what I mean? And they did well after that, but yeah, their first, I guess, intro to combat wasn't that great. But anyway, Patch had arrived on the 19th. So as soon as Patch arrived, apparently he's wearing Marine Corps utilities, which I thought was interesting. So he arrived, went straight to see Vandegrift in the command post, got a bit of a briefing. Then he jumped in a Jeep and went straight up to Seabury. So some of the accounts, most accounts say Seabury was in charge the whole time. But then once you read the primary accounts, you got to know, once the division general reaches the command post, he's not going to go, "Okay, my brigadier, you can just keep running this show." No, he's in charge. He's in charge, and he remained there the whole time. You can just see that on the 20th, he was very concerned that this is the first time in combat, and one of his units are running back. So he's went up to the front, too, to visit the battalion commander. But yeah, the Seabury and the G3 both got silver stars for that, for managed to rally the men. It was pretty bad. So the first day after the 20th didn't go well for them, but they managed to reconsolidate the lines. And then the 164th had been pulled back to the rear as a reserve. You can imagine they'd been fighting pretty hard. And then they were told, basically, saddle up, jump on the trucks, you're moving up to the front. And they wasn't impressed at all. They wasn't very happy with the 182nd. Very ropeable, as they say. You can read their primary accounts if you speak to one of the old vets, or not many around, but yeah, I've heard one tell me that too. They weren't impressed with the Massachusetts boys, they call them. Not these North Dakota farm boys weren't impressed with the Massachusetts or city boys.
But we're a long way from the continental United States. Do we know what sort of level of training the 182nd boys had? Because they hadn't been, it was a week that they'd been in Guardalcanal, wasn't it? So their training within the AO would have been extremely limited.
They trained in New Caledonia because all of them were from New Caledonia. That was the Matanikau division. So they'd been training there, had defensive position to start with. Then they did some training. They got to remember, these units were National Guard. A lot of the Deadwood, as they call the pre-Army National Guard, which was, they were loaded with like politically appointees, like your mayor, your banker, reserve type units with little to no training. And it's kind of a social type club. But then when they were federalized in 1941, when FDR federalized the National Guard, the quality got better. They started implementing bringing in some of the junior regular officers and running through officer candidate school, putting them through tests. So some of the Deadwoods, some of the older guys and some of the non-fit guys were going out. Then they instituted a boot camp. Before there was no boot camp. You just showed up at the unit and they trained you in-house. So there's no standardized that. So the resources was scarce. But then once they started thinking, okay, there's war on the horizon, then they started tightening them up. But you still had that same clicky associated with click top associated with these National Guard units for the good and bad. And that's why you see, for example, some things that would happen in a unit back home impacted the whole unit in the town. And then, which is an unfortunate thing, because if they suffer a lot of casualties, say, for example, on Normandy, you got the famous Bedford boys from Bedford, Virginia. They were a National Guard unit. And I don't know, they were in their first wave on Omaha Beach, and a lot of those guys died. So it impacted this whole little town. And you can just see potentially, like, say, for example, so-and-so's wife's kid's sick, or, worst case scenario, so-and-so is messing around with so-and-so back home, and they hear that, and it just impacts the whole unit. So, yeah, and then this first combat, there's a lot of, even it happened regular units, but especially these National Guard units, in this first combat, after the first combats, you see a lot of guys starting to be pulled out. People that can actually do the job get promoted. And once it can't get promoted, you're out of there. A lot of screening. So especially you will see later with the regimental commanders, if they are even pulled out, they shortly would be. Because most of these regimental commanders, National Guard, were older. And then once they reached Guadalcanal, if they did get there, they wouldn't fire before or leave before. Just the brutal terrain and the physical terrain and the tropics made a lot of them sick. They weren't up for it because they're too old.
So the 164th goes in to reinforce the line. What happened next?
Yeah, so they said, well, Patch and Seabreeze, we're up against a pretty strong line. So the 164th, they sent them straight in, and I think the pressure was on the Army. That's just my opinion, that this is the first time they're kind of in combat on Guadalcanal. A lot of people are looking for them to perform. And I think they were getting a bit frustrated, and they said, just push through. We'll hit them with artillery, blast that area, and we'll just push through. Once again, you just can't push through a concrete wall, and that's what they were going up against. They couldn't flank it. And you got to remember, this is the days before they had bazookas or flamethrowers or anything like that. So you had an M1 Garand rifle, maybe machine gun and grenades going against fixed Japanese positions. And one officer said the only way you can destroy them would have to be a 155 millimeter hit and above, because they're so strong, and plus interlocking fire. And these are the first time in combat for a lot of these guys, especially offensive combat. And they're just literally going into a meat grinder and a buzzsaw. That's what it was, a buzzsaw. So it sent the 164th up. They said, okay, you're attacking at 6:30 on the 21st. And these guys had just reached the line. Some of them were still moving around at night. And they said, well, we haven't done prior reconnaissance. We don't even know which way is which. We don't even know where the attack departure is. We haven't coordinated anything. So the time the kickoff point came, after all the large artillery prep, nothing happened. Nothing happened for 1 hour, 2 hours. And then it got to the point where about 10 o'clock, they had a big command meeting. And it was finally the 164 were getting into their positions. They said, okay, this is what we're going to do. Then at 12 o'clock, a little after that, they started their attack. You got to remember, whatever benefits this artillery barrage had 4 hours later were long gone. The Japanese waited for them. So most of them didn't even make it off the, because remember, they're taking, you've been there. It's hard for the readers or readers, till I'm an author, the viewers or the listeners to understand, but they've got to go down 100, 200 foot, basically cliff, go into thick jungle terrain, cross a stream, then they've got to go up another 150, 200 foot cliff. At the same time, it's like a big bowl. Same time, you've got enfilade fire on all sides. First time in offensive type combat. And some of these attack routes are limited. You just can't have a ridge and everyone go on line straight off because it's so steep. Sometimes you got to limit it to certain tracks in a single file. So Japanese would see that and they drop mortar and just smash them. So most of the companies, attack companies, didn't even make it 50 yards before they stopped in their tracks. Casualties mounted up and then everyone pulled back. So that day was gone, had a massive amount of casualties. They had to regroup. How are we going to do this? That was the 21st. And then it turned into the 22nd. Okay, we're going to do it again. This stage, they said they were holding the 8th Marines, obviously, to push to Cucambona. But they said, we got to break this line to start before we even get to Cucambona. So they brought the 8th Marines up and they put the 8th Marine battalions right behind the 164. They said, well, once the 164th breaks through the lines, the Marines can punch through. So the 22nd started, same thing. Large artillery bombardment. And a lot of times they couldn't do the large exactly in the ravine because they're too close to the troops. They're hitting with 81 millimeter and 60 millimeter mortars. A lot of the artillery is firing overhead. Same thing, same results. 22nd. Nothing's changing. Same techniques. They haven't tried to adapt their techniques. They're trying to bull their way through. Bull the way through. It's not working. 23rd come. They go, okay, this is what we'll do. We'll use the 8th Marines. We'll have to use them. The 8th Marines. Here's the Marines now. Come show us how it's done. We'll use the Marines to be the main attack force on the 23rd. But what we'll do, we'll pull everyone back 300 yards. And what that will do, that will allow us now to concentrate the 155s, 105 straight into that ravine and hit these Japanese positions like dead on. That way we won't on. Subject to our guys to friendly fire, potential friendly fire. Now, Pedro Deval, which is the Marine Artillery Commander, had spoken to some of the Army and said, well, that's probably not a good thing to do because we found in our techniques by fighting these Japanese, if you pull back, the Japanese will run their screening forces very quickly into the positions you just left. That's what they do. They're very fast. Anyway, that's what's happened. They pull back. They massive bombardment. And the Marines, at that stage too, hadn't had a chance to go and do proper reconnaissance. They were told, you're attacking, go straight into the line. They didn't have proper reconnaissance, same thing as 164. And then by the time they were moving to the attack point, they go across a couple of ravines, even get there, and it delayed them an hour. And sure enough, as soon as they're starting to reach their line of departures, when the Army moved back, they had to fight some of the Japanese screening teams. So about midday, the Marines finally made it. They've pushed down into the ravine. Once again, same results. They get hit hard. But the Marines started pushing forward a bit. They'll make a little more progress. And at that one stage, they were looking for support from the Army. They couldn't get support to the right-hand side. One Marine battalion was doing quite well. Other Marine battalion was stopped. Couldn't go backwards and forwards because the Japanese 90mm mortars were hitting them. They pulled back. And then their battalion commander went to speak to the Army battalion commander, a guy called Lieutenant Colonel Hall, the guys that did quite well in the Battle of Henderson Field at Coffin Corner. And when they was talking to him, a whole Japanese mortar barrage hit the command post. Wounded 2 battalion commanders, killed like 19 of the guys. And after that, it was over. Patch didn't really know what to do. And then General Thomas, I think we talked about Thomas. He's the chief of staff for the division, Marine Division, had been sent up to see what's going on. And he was talking to Patch. And this is in Thomas's interview and his memoirs. And I read some of the Army stuff. It all correlates. And he tells Patch, he goes, yeah, you can't attack anymore. He goes, I don't think Vandergeer's going to be happy. And Patch says, well, I can't attack. I need my 3rd Regiment, the 132nd. They'll be due here in a couple of weeks. I can't attack anymore. I just can't go any forward. He goes, I don't think Vandergeer's going to be happy. He goes, okay. He says, I think you need, to my Patch, I think you need to get into the Jeep and go back to the perimeter, explain this to Vandergeer yourself. He goes, yeah, I think that might be a good idea. But Thomas had made it back spoke to Vandergeer before. And once again, he told Vandergeer. Vandergeer got visibly angry. And this is in his version. Thomas goes, look, it is what it is. He goes, yeah, you're right. Anyway, Pat shows up. He explains the situation. He goes, look, I can't go any further. I need my 3rd Regiment to be able to do this. I'm just killing men for, we can't achieve it. He goes, okay. So that ended. On the 23rd, it ended the battle in 5th Matanikau. Well, what that did, though, it wasn't a complete defeat by the Americans. I call it a draw because the Japanese, at the same time, the 228th of the 38th Division, their division command posts had landed. So their intent was to push the Americans away from the whole west bank of Matanikau and hold that because, once again, they were going to hold that area until another group of Japanese came. They were going to use that as a jumping off point. So what that did was, from then on, it denied the Japanese the west bank of Matanikau River. From then on, for the rest of the campaign, the Japanese never went to the west bank. So that denied the Japanese. So that was kind of a draw. The Americans didn't achieve their full objective battalion Kukubono, but they seized Matanikau once and for all. That Point Cruz line, you had both forces looking at each other over 100 to 200 yards on 2 ridge lines, evolved into a 6 weeks of no man's land. 6 week, it resembled a World War I or Great War style battlefield for 6 weeks, the Point Cruz line. So that's the 5th Battle of Matanikau and the last Battle of Matanikau.
Whilst they're waiting at this point, I think because the thing I find really interesting about this is the fact that the US is starting to transition to be on the defensive as business as usual. And tactically, you've got US Army troops taking over from Marines. The Marines have been doing a little bit of offensive work, but predominantly defensive. Yeah. And so we've got this flip now where offensive tactics need to be developed because clearly in the jungle, and particularly on the steep ravines where you've got artillery which is not as effective because it's very hard to hit, particularly on a reverse slope. If the guns are firing onto the reverse slope, it's extremely difficult. You've got to be firing in high angle. You need to observe it. So it's very difficult from a technical point of view to be able to do that. Mortar's a lot better, but tends to be unobserved fire. So once again, can't be adjusted. So artillery becomes less effective. The Japanese are excellent at digging in and camouflage and concealment. So the Army and Marines are now sort of going to be developing doctrine pretty much as they go to be able to, as economically as possible, dig the Japanese out of their incredibly well-constructed defensive positions.
Yes, there's one thing I forgot to say at the 5th Matanikau. Once again, this is all a learning process, especially from the Army. Guardalcanal, as we know, was a great inter-service cooperation. They worked quite well together, but there were still hiccups along the way. One was the Marines actually would told the Army, I said, look, don't let the Japanese, if you go on an offensive, keep hitting them, keep hitting them, keep hitting them. Don't allow them a chance. I think one Marine said, just like, keep your boot on their neck. Don't let them get up. Just keep the offensive on them. So the Army says their tactics was going to move and establish position. And what they did that first day when they moved their units over, instead of just, so what I'm saying is, instead of just moving 2 battalions up, they potentially should have just moved 2 whole regiments up and just tried to push them through. Because what they did that first day by going in setting and not continuously moving with everything they had, that allowed the Japanese to move more forces to the line very quickly. And that's something they did. I mean, Edson actually said, don't let the Japanese, if you let them move in, they'll dig in and you can't dig them out. And Haidetake actually in their writings, they knew there was the Americans using different tactics compared to the 1st of November tactics. After the first day, they said, why is Americans slower and acting a bit sluggish? Normally they hit us with everything they got and they just keep pushing. But they're allowing us to move forces in. So that's what they did. That's why you seen on their first night, they sent 2 fresh companies in very quickly and hit that Army unit. But the Army learned very quickly too. Once again, this is all a learning process. That was the first time in combat. Some of the Marines at the time, commanders they'd always seen at Causey Point was kind of putting the Army down. But they seemed to forget themselves in the first weeks that the Marines were on the island. They'd made some of the same mistakes. So once again, it's a whole learning process. But yeah, the fight adapt to tactics that the other forces, whether it's pride or whatever, who knows, but they didn't listen. Or it didn't get to the commanders, or I don't know what happened, but there was a disconnect somewhere there.
Well, I think critically, it's a very little time for those lessons learned to be transferred from the Marines to the Army at all levels, for the soldiers on the front line, all the way up to the regimental headquarters and even divisional.
When the 8th Marines came from Samoa, they've been there since January. And that's why you see when they come in you can always see with 8th Marines in Guardalcanal photos because they're wearing the old Kelly style, or as Australians and Brits know, Brody helmets. Now, some had the newer, some had the older ones, so they're in transition periods. But if you read their reports, they had no information coming from Guadalcanal about the fighting and lessons learned. So they just arrived kind of blind themselves. And that's in the same organization of reports of lessons going back.
The role of lessons learned, because we see this throughout the combat with the Japanese. The British took time to get lessons learned. The Australians took time to build up that lessons learned capability, because it wasn't overly difficult to come up with a recipe to defeat the Japanese, but it was very expensive to get those lessons, and the lessons learned bit was often missing, which meant that other people had to learn the exact same lesson. Yeah, the lessons are expensive. So the official history says that between the 19th and the 25th of November, 117 of the 164th had been killed and 208 had been wounded. 325 had been evacuated from the island because of wounds or illness, and 300 more men had been rendered ineffective by wounds, malaria, dysentery, or neuroses, and were kept in the rear areas. So they had been reduced down to 2,000 fit for combat by the 25th.
Yeah, November's the bloodiest for Americans, the bloodiest month of the campaign. This whole, I call it BS about this whole mopping up. This is totally wrong. I mean, you can see in November, late November, there was no mopping up there. Both forces wasn't moving anywhere. The Americans couldn't get the Japanese out, and they were like he said, they're flipping their posture from a defensive to an offensive. And obviously, an offensive posture, you lose more. And that's just the way the game's, well, I won't say game, but it's the way it's played. And then the 8th Marines had 400 casualties in that month. That's including sick, wounded, and killed. 400. No one had the highest casualty rate of any regiment in such a short period of time during the whole campaign. And a lot of people don't even know the 8th Marines were even there, like the 2nd Marine Division. They don't even know it. It's all about the 1st Marine Division. 1st Marine Division, keep saying this, the popular perception is 1st Marine Division's landed, fought Alligator Creek, fought Bloody Ridge, held the Japanese off in Harrison Field. Japanese were defeated. Army came in, just cleaned up what was left. And that was it. That seems to be the popular myth. I've been studying it for years and speaking to hundreds and hundreds of people, and that's entirely wrong.
Well, that's the thing. You might be thinking that the Japanese are defeated by the time of 5th Matanikau, but tragically, the Japanese aren't aware of that yet.
No. I mean, obviously, the Japanese, and we'll see in December, January, wasn't the same Japanese soldier or force in early October. I mean, they're basically offensively spent themselves and sick and wounded and casualties and everything, but they still are forced to be reckoned with. And they wasn't breaking up in small pockets. They were determined, organized for it. In fact, some of them were very brand new. They were fresh units. You had a whole regiment, half of fresh Japanese on the island fighting on those lines against not so fresh Americans. So yeah, no one's told the Japanese you're defeated. Yeah, you're right.
And there's an important asymmetry there because many of those fresh troops that are coming in, they're not new troops. They're probably veteran troops. They've probably fought in the jungle before. So they know exactly what they're doing, as opposed to new troops who are fresh to the jungle and have never fought in the jungle and never fought the Japanese before.
Yeah, well, the 228th, the 230th, and the 229th, I don't know if you remember your Hong Kong history. Yeah, they're the ones that took Hong Kong. Yeah, they're involved in atrocities and brutality. Well, that's just the Japanese way. But they were experienced troops. And plus, they went on to take on Timor, Java. They were in the East Indies after that, the same division. So they were and plus, you got to remember some of the Chinese veterans too, so of the Chinese war. So they're very switched on. And we discussed it many other times. The Japanese didn't send their B troops to Guadalcanal. All their top troops went to Guadalcanal in the campaign. That's air, sea, and land. They sent only the best they had.
And so just after this, on the 30th of November, we've got the Battle of Tassafaronga, which is a stunning defeat for the US Navy. It's called the Night of the Long Lances, where Japanese destroyers from the Tokyo Express, so once again, another one of these supply runs, they're using the destroyers to try and get the supplies in, which isn't the best way of doing it, but they're trying to get as much logistics support into the troops on the ground. They sink one heavy cruiser and cripple 3 others with torpedoes for the loss of 1 destroyer. Big defeat for the United States Navy. However, the IJN is unable to land those supplies. And so we're seeing a growing dominant narrative of the inability of the Imperial Japanese Navy to supply the troops on Guadalcanal.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you use this one, you've seen the famous photos of the whole bows blown off of these heavy cruisers. Put coconut logs to float them back. So it's it. But the Japanese they were using quite innovative techniques. Fortunately for them, it didn't work. Like the supplying with submarine supplies would have, they put fuel drums would have been half filled or 3/4 filled, and they would pop up with the submarines at night. They'd drop these fuel drums off, and some of them were tied in with ropes, like all together. Then the Japanese in a little Daihatsu landing craft was supposed to go out with sticks or poles and pull them all back. Some worked, some didn't. But the Americans, the next day, the Cactus Air Force, they took turns blasting all the floating barrels that was floating around. They'd sink those barrels. So that it's good thought, like we said in Marine Corps, good intentions, bad judgment. So they tried, but they just couldn't get enough to the shore. And then you had the fast destroyer for, once again, they would drop off supplies. And the whole thing, too, about the Japanese, you got to remember, they're dropping them off on the far northwest coast of Guadalcanal, 20 miles away from the front line. So how are you going to get them from point A to point B? And then you had guys who were barely able to walk, but they took, quote, the fittest. And I say it in my book, the fittest Japanese would be a primary candidate for an American hospital if it was an American line. You know what I mean? They're suffering from fever and sickness, but there was enough to walk and carry a box. But they had to go from all the way there, walk miles and miles and miles through, up and down these hills and jungles and everything, ravines, to even carry the supplies to the front line. So that was the whole issue too. And once the limited amount of supplies did make it there, then you got to get it up to the front line. So that was very problematic for them. And then the Japanese, quite interesting, reading the diaries. And I came across this in my next book. They call them demons. The Japanese, behind the lines, they had these group of Japanese running around, and they call them the Japanese name for demons. So they were guys who were robbing and killing the other Japanese behind the lines to take the food. So you get these porters carrying the food. These Japanese stragglers or deserters or whatever they would be behind the lines, these demons would jump out and kill them and get food. It was turned into a bit of a rabble behind the lines. Very interesting. You don't read about in any other account.
That really does show the degree to which morale has collapsed then within some elements of the Japanese troops on Guadalcanal, that they've effectively turned rogue and are killing to get food.
Yes, desperate situations, and the whole, obviously, disciplines broken down to certain units, but then some of the frontline guys are still pretty hardcore.
One of the other things that I think is really interesting, so the US Army history states that the area of Guadalcanal held by American troops in December was not much greater than that captured in the assault landing. that really highlights the ferocity of the campaign up until now, where the Marines and increasingly the Army have been fighting just to maintain the perimeter.
Yeah, that's what because once again, it's mainly defensive. What we discussed, everything was about those airfields. We can say there's 3 there now, but by late December, there's 3 airfields around that perimeter. So that's the key. You can have the rest of the island, just that small airfield. All I have to do is defend it. And then once you defend the airfield, then at one stage you got to push the Japanese off the island somehow. But yeah, the main intent was just to keep that airfield running and keep the Japanese from taking it.
And so we've got Major General Patch. He's the commander of the 14th Corps. He's arrived and he'll take over from Major General Vandergriff on the 9th of December.
Yeah, so the 14th Corps starts in January, and that's all I can talk about why that happened. But yeah, so the official handover date for everything, and like I said before, they're transitioning. They were starting to transition anyway. But the official handover date was 9 of December, and that's the date Vandergriff flew out. So he flew out. There was some elements of the division still there. The first elements were left on the 9th. I think by the end of the month of December, everyone from the 1st Marine Division was gone. So they became an Army command. And that's another misconception. When the Marines left in December, not all the Marines left. Some people think, oh, all the Marines left. The Army took over. There was still 14 to 15,000 Marines there. Remember, the 2nd Marine Division will arrive on the headquarters, and another regiment and some of the artillery will arrive on the 4th of January, 1943. But you had a whole Marine Air Wing there. You had 2 full Marine regiments, a couple of Marine and other auxiliary battalions, like defense battalions and so forth. So you had, end of December 1st, when 5th of January came, there were something like 15,000 Marines under Patch's command. So the whole Marine Division was still there. And that's another thing that people, the Marines left. The Marines didn't leave. Marines never left.
And so he's also got the Matanikau Division with the 164th, 182nd and the 132nd. That'll have come in shortly. And the 25th Infantry Division is coming in with the 27th, 35th and 161st Regiments. They're National Guard, are they?
No, so it's quite unique. So the 25th Division under one of my favorites, J. Lawton Collins, Major General Lawton Collins, one of the youngest division commanders, later became a real famous and successful corps commander under Eisenhower in Europe. In fact, my grandfather was in the Army more too. He fought under Collins in the 7th Corps in Europe, and he always had good things to say about. And I always knew about Collins, but it wasn't until I really started researching my second book on the U.S. Army that I'm thinking, this guy's a fairly dynamic commander and a real switched-on guy, real hands-on, frontline guy, very, very switched, very, very innovative. So he had a real good trained unit, and they were Hawaiian-based, and they formed, I think he had the Hawaiian Division pre-war. They morphed into 2 divisions, the 24th and the 25th, and they incorporated, I call them hybrid divisions. They had 2 regular Army regiments, the 27th and the 35th. They brought in the 161st Washington National Guard unit, which they felt like bastards. They used to call themselves second-class citizens, and some of them when the war first started. But the 35th and the 27th is what you'd expect of the old Army. If you ever see the movie From Here to Eternity or read the book, James Jones, was his first book, second one's Thin Red Line. But he gives a good depiction of how the pre-war Army was. In fact, a lot of the core group of those units had a lot of semblance with the 1st Marine Division, with their, quote, old breed, old corps. The old hard NCOs. He'd been doing that for years and training and things like that. So he had a good core of those guys. There was a very well-trained division. So initially, when they left Hawaii, they were going to Australia under MacArthur's command. Major General Harmon, who was, I said before, was Army South Pacific commander, had been pushing to get the Marines relieved. These guys need to be relieved. The 1st Marine Division needs to be relieved. And he appealed to General Marshall, and he goes, look, we've got the 25th Division. Can we have them? Because we have no other divisions really available, because MacArthur has the other Army divisions. And they couldn't give him a decision. And finally, in the late November, they gave him a decision. Okay, you can have the 25th to relieve the 1st Marine Division. So when the Matanikau relieved the 1st Marine Division, it was the 25th. So here they are, chugging along. They get orders to go to New Caledonia, the Verde. Oh, okay, what's going on here? They arrive. Admiral Halsey, that's time the South Pacific commander, Collins goes to see him. Because remember, all their ships have been administrative loaded, because they're going to Australia to do training. They're not going into combat. He rocks up. He goes to see Halsey, and he's talking to Halsey, and he says, I got a fine trained division, and blah, blah. This is from Halsey's on memoirs. I've read the memoirs of Collins. It's roughly the same. And he's telling Halsey, I got a fine trained division, will go well under MacArthur, blah, blah, blah. And then Collins says he sees a grin a big grin on Halsey's face, keeps grinning. And then Halsey tells him, he goes, well, he breaks the news, well, you're going to Guadalcanal. He goes, okay. He goes, Collins says, give me a few days, probably 3, 4, 5 days. I should be able to do some transition to get my ship's combat repacked, do a few things. And he was talking. And then that's when he noticed the grin on Halsey's face. And he said, what's funny, sir? And he goes, are you leaving tomorrow morning? He said, and Collins says, well, okay. He took it like a soldier. He goes, that's what we'll do. So he took a risk and a gamble because they knew these guys, the Marine divisions, need to be relieved very quickly. But if they allowed the 25th to pack and unpack, that could be a week up to 10 days. And then you had transit time. So we needed them in now. So Harmon took that risk. And Marshall actually, I seen the message traffic between both of them. And Marshall says, look, if you want to take that risk, it's all on you. I'll support you. So they knew they were going to land into a secured perimeter. Right, so they wouldn't make an amphibious assault or nothing like that. So they could land administrative-wise in a secure perimeter. And there's enough things there for you when you arrive that you can go straight into combat if you need to. And that's what they did. And you'll see they put these guys in combat very quickly because they started to realize, both sides did realize at that point, even if a unit arrives on Guadalcanal after 1 week or 2 weeks, they start to deteriorate. From the sickness and the heat, they start to sap their strength of an offensive unit. And they were Patch and Harmon had intended to use the 25th as their main hammer unit to do their main offensive. They're planning a big offensive for January, and they were going to use the 25th as their main punch to go all the way to whatever they had to do. So they needed to conserve the energy. And then the way that the staggered time frame, the division would all be on Guadalcanal by the first week in January. And then the first units started landing in 17th of December. I think the night before he left, Collins had spoke to Vandergrift and Thomas because they'd flew in and they were in New Caledonia, so they got a bit of a briefing. But he flew in, I think, 2 days before the 17th, and he was there. There's a famous photo of him on the beach welcoming his first troops in, which was the 35th Regiment coming in. Just to show you how admin packed they were when the 35th Regiment, the first unit that arrived, a lot of them were wearing blue jean tops and blue jean bottoms. That was the Americans' Army's denim they wore, like work denim. Not combat fatigues. A lot of them didn't have combat fatigues. That's why you see in all the Guadalcanal photos, they're wearing one piece all-drab overalls because it was what was spare and they gave to them. Japanese was quite unique. When the 35th made it out to Mount Austin, I read one Japanese account by a Japanese battalion commander in his diary. Now, I never connected until I started thinking. He says, the Americans were relieved and I seen these new Americans had blue suits on. And I always thought, that's a bit strange. What's he talking about there? And then when I started seeing these live photos of these 35th landing, a lot of them had these denim suits on. I'm like, well, there you go. I said they're wearing blue jeans. It's quite funny. Little interesting things. Anyway, yeah, so that was the 25th Division. A good unit.
Well, that sets us up well for the next episode, which will be where we move to the south now and look at the battle for Mount Austin.
Yeah, so the 132nd, the new unit of the Matanikau Division, the one that Patch was waiting for to come on, that he was going to use in the offensive. In the meantime, I always got this, that is, just set them up here a little training exercise and just clean out these little remnants on Mount Austin. And yeah, that'll be a good one because that leads a lot into the campaign and what happened after that. Very important.
Excellent. Well, once again, thank you very much, Dave. There's lots to unpack there as we looked at the 5th Battle of the Matanikau.
Yeah, so we're leaving my beloved Matanikau and then we're going up into the hills to the galloping horse and the seahorse and things like that. So yeah, it'll be interesting. I'm looking forward to it.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James.
A big thank you once again to Dave for really bringing out the lessons of the combat that occurred during the Guardalcanal campaign. For me, one big takeaway, you can really see the difference in combat performance, the ability to generate combat power between the 164th and the 182nd. So both National Guard units originally, the 164th was North Dakota National Guard, 182nd was Massachusetts National Guard. However, by this point of the campaign, the 164th had already seen their first combat, and that was at Henderson Field. Obviously, there's a difference fighting on the defensive as opposed to the offensive. However, that experience, that extra few weeks, and we're only talking about 3.5 weeks here, on Guadalcanal has enabled them to perform with a lot more confidence. We'll leave the episode there and we will return next week as we start to look at the inland campaign.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.